All right, well, good afternoon. Thank you all for taking time on this very cold, icy day to meet with me and learn a little bit more about the thesis and dissertation process here at UCA. I have several slides that I'll go through, and then at the end, I'll be able to try to answer your questions. You can use the chat feature, or there is a Q&A feature where you can enter your questions. As I'm going through this, I can't see people if they've chatted or raised their hand. So it may appear like I'm ignoring you, but I don't mean to do that intentionally. I guess I should start by saying who I am. So I'm Dr. Barlow. I'm Dean of the Graduate School, and I'm really happy to have this opportunity to share this information with you at this point. I don't know if y'all know this, but at the end, when you've written your thesis or your dissertation, the very last step is I read it and I provide you with feedback on it. And so part of this webinar is to provide you with information to offset some of the issues that I've had to work with students with in the past. So with that as an introduction, let me start this slideshow. The goal for this afternoon is to just bring awareness to procedures and processes, and there are three areas that I want to pay attention to. One is just general procedural information. So if you're at that end and you want to know what are the steps that I should be taking in my last semester, I'll go through that. I also want to talk about avoiding common mistakes, which I mentioned just a moment ago. I've been doing this for several semesters, and so I see some of the same things each time. So I'm trying to help people to avoid mistakes. And then I also want to share some resources for supporting student success. With that said, there is information for students, regardless of where you are in that process of completing your thesis or dissertation. And so I want to launch a poll to just find out who's in the room. And there will be two questions. So one is describing what is selecting the option that best describes you, and that'll help me to understand where you are in your process of writing a thesis or a dissertation. And then the second question is, are you working on a thesis or a dissertation? So let me launch this particular poll. And again, it has two questions, so please take a moment to respond to both questions. And now I'll end the poll, and it should be that you all can see the results. So I hope you can see these. In terms of the first question, it looks like a lot of us are in the proposal stage. So we're in that early part where you're thinking about what your study will look like, or maybe you're writing about that proposal and getting ready to defend it. And then we've got another group that's preparing to graduate, and we do have a faculty member, which is awesome. And then in terms of thesis or dissertation, we're pretty closely split. So about even between master's student and doctoral students. So that's good. All right, that helps me to know who I'm talking about. All right. So the way I thought about this presentation was to think about students as being in that early stage, which includes, you know, you're going to be writing a thesis or a dissertation, and maybe you're at the beginning stage of thinking about your committee, to the mid stage, which is where we're moving from maybe proposal to data collection, and then final stage is you're writing this thing up and you're ready to get out of here. So I want to talk about those three stages and what information I can help you at this point related to those. I will provide that. And then I also want to take this as an opportunity to mention continuous enrollment. So to begin with early stage, historically, there's only been two things you had to think about early from the graduate school perspective. Now, of course, if you are writing a thesis or a dissertation, there's a lot of early stage work that comes in the form of discussion, talking with faculty, identifying who your faculty are going to be, etc. From our perspective, though, historically, there's been two forms, but good news, we've done away with the notice of intent to complete a thesis form. So if anyone says, have you filed your notice of intent? That's not necessary. It was never necessary for a dissertation. All PhD students were going to do that. For master's students, we have a way of knowing whether you're going to do it or not, so we don't require that form anymore. Good news. The other form, though, the thesis or dissertation committee selection form, is one that we require. And so anyone who is completing or thesis or dissertation is required to file that form. You should do that in the first semester that you enroll in thesis or dissertation hours. Sometimes it comes later, and that's okay, But what happens is you end up, we put a hold on your account because we want to have that form before you move forward. And so then it just delays registration, or we have to lift the hold temporarily, allow you to register, and then put it back on. And we're not going to keep doing that every semester. So it's best to just go ahead and get this done. And again, that's going to mean talking to your faculty, identifying your chair of your committee and talking with your chair about who the other committee members might be, talking with those potential committee members and getting them to agree. And then when you're ready and you've got your names and everybody's agreed to it, then you can submit your form. This form, like all of our forms, are available on the graduate school website. There's a tab that says forms. And then this is the actual address for that. This form was recently converted into a digital form. And so that means that as the student, you cannot initiate the form. So your chair will have to do that, which is just another reason to have those conversations about who will be on your committee. All committee members have to be on graduate faculty, and your chair can help you to know who those people are as well. And if you have questions about someone, like if you've got an idea of maybe someone from off campus, or maybe someone who's not associated with a graduate program on our campus, and so they don't have graduate faculty status, you just talk to us and we'll help you to navigate that process. So in terms of the early stage, outside of those conversations and getting to know your faculty, the only thing that you have to do from our perspective at the graduate school is complete that committee selection form. So now mid-stage, and when I think about the mid-stage students, I think about those who are writing a proposal and moving into their work on their thesis or dissertation. So I want to talk about the requirements of the proposal versus a thesis dissertation. So for the proposal, the graduate school doesn't have any particular guidelines. So guidelines related to what goes in your proposal or what format it should take, et cetera, those are all determined by the program, and you'll have to talk to your program coordinator and or your chair to get those program guidelines to know what's expected. Typically, we see in a proposal an introduction that sets the stage for whatever it is you're going to study, the literature review, which gives the background and the context so that we can see how your study fits within that larger picture, and then your methodology. What is it you're going to do? Of course, those don't apply to some of our programs, like I'm thinking about creative writing or film, and they're going to have different expectations for their proposal, and those will be outlined in their program guidelines. The important thing to remember is that as you are writing your proposal, you're writing in future tense. You're talking about the things that you will do. You will go here to collect data, or you will be surveying these individuals as a part of your study. As you transition into a thesis or a dissertation, you're still going to have your program guidelines that you have to follow. But then in addition, now you need to pay attention to the graduate school guidelines. And our guidelines trump the program guidelines, they trump your style guide, et cetera. So be sure that you're taking a look at those, and I'll show you where to find those in just a few minutes. As you write, look at those guidelines. One of the things that you want to be thinking about throughout this whole process is whether you're going to complete a traditional or a non-traditional format, and that's a topic I'll talk about in just a moment. And then also, as you prepare your thesis or your dissertation, be sure to write it in past tense. So whereas the proposal said you said things like, I will survey these folks, in the thesis or the dissertation, you should write, I surveyed these folks. So even if you do a copy and paste, if you copy something out of the proposal and paste it into the dissertation, you're going to have to go through and read it and look for places to change the tense, because it is a report of what you've already done. And again, there are exceptions to that when it comes to some of the programs where scholarship looks different from the traditional research study, and those things are addressed in program guidelines. Throughout the whole process, you should be looking at your style guide to know how to format tables, figures, citations, etc. In my discipline, we use APA. So that's the style guide that I'm referring to. Others may use MLA, some use Chicago style. It just really varies from one program to the next. And so you should be asking your chair, what is my style guide? And then get the style guide. Don't count on online tools as a place where you to make it easy. get the style guide so that you can easily get your questions answered and know that they're correct. So before I move forward, I do want to quickly poll our audience as to how you're thinking about your thesis or dissertation. And if you don't know, you can say, I don't know, but I'm asking the question, are you planning to use have a traditionally formatted thesis or dissertation, or do you see yourself using a non-traditional format? So let me pull up that poll. And so your choices are traditional format, non-traditional format, I'm not sure, or not applicable, because we may have some folks in the audience who are here just to hear information and they're not actually going to write one of these for right now. Our responses are coming in. I'll give y'all a few more seconds. And I'll end the poll and share the results. And it looks like most of us are thinking about the traditional format, which is great. We have a few that are thinking about the non-traditional format or planning on the non-traditional format, which is awesome. We have a few that are not sure, and that is fine. And of course, we've got one not applicable. So let me stop sharing. Okay. So that helps me to know what we're thinking out there in the audience. So a traditional format is one where you have, typically it's 5 chapters. It starts with an introduction, it has a literature review, methodology, results, and a discussion and conclusion. So that's the traditional format. That's what we imagine there. In a thesis or dissertation at UCA, you're also going to have what we call the front matter. And then of course, afterwards, you will have your references and appendices. So a lot of the information, well, all of the information about what goes in the front matter, you will find in the thesis or dissertation guide. Please look at the guide to know what is in the front matter. And then of course, your references and appendices are at the end. In contrast, for non-traditional formats, we actually have 2 non-traditional formats. One is the format that's utilized by our Master of Fine Arts programs. So both film and creative writing do something different with theirs, and theirs is described a little bit in the graduate school's guidelines, but y'all should be taking a close look at your program guidelines. And that's where you'll find the best information for how to write and format yours. It isn't called a non-traditional format because it doesn't match that format I showed just a second ago. The second type of non-traditional format that we have is what's commonly referred to as an alternative format. And the alternative format, we've had some information about those in our guidelines for a while, but it's just been in the last, I'd say 2 years, maybe 3, that we put a little bit more information in our graduate school guidelines. So I put new in quotation marks because this information has been there for about 2.5 years, but it's still new to some people. So I do want to talk for just a minute about what the graduate school guidelines look like for those alternative format thesis and dissertations, because that's where a lot of the questions tend to come up. So there's a lot of flexibility with an alternative format, but typically this is employed when someone is writing a manuscript. So rather than thinking about writing a thesis that's like, I don't know, 100 pages, 200 pages, instead it's, I want to write this manuscript that's ready to be submitted. So it hasn't been submitted, it's ready to be submitted. And some programs will say you need to write 1. Some programs will say you need to have 2. Some will say 3. So that's up to the program how many manuscripts are going to be a part of your thesis or dissertation. What we ask in the graduate school, and this is what's outlined in our guidelines, is that regardless of the number of manuscripts, those manuscripts are actually chapters in the document. And then we ask that you put an introductory chapter and a conclusion chapter with those. So the introduction and the conclusion are bookending those manuscript chapters, if you want to think about it that way. The introduction, it doesn't have to be very long, but basically it's telling the reader, okay, there's going to be these 2 manuscripts. Here's kind of the big idea that connects the 2 and why these are important ideas. And then in chapter 4, it ties it all together. So you might have had a set of results in chapter 2, a set of results for chapter 3. And then in chapter 4, you're saying these are how those 2 sets come together to answer kind of the bigger question that you are after. In terms of like the other pieces, you'll still have the front matter for this. You'll still have the references and the appendices, but Another difference with the alternative format is that if you have, and you should, references and or appendices with your manuscripts, they go with the chapters. So I don't know if y'all can see my pointer. I'm going to hope you can. But references that are a part of chapter 1 and chapter 4, those come at the end. But the references for chapter 2 appear with chapter 2. The references for chapter 3 appear with chapter 3, because those are supposed to be manuscripts that are ready for submission. And a part of that would be including your references. Now, I show this diagram that has 2 manuscripts in it, but it is not always the case that 2 manuscripts are used, as I said a moment ago. So there's a lot of flexibility with what goes in between chapters 1 and 4. So as another example, oftentimes we'll have a program that will say, okay, I want you to write a single manuscript, but then I want you to write an extended literature review and an extended methods. In other words, the manuscript has a small section for literature review, but we want you to write a bigger lit review that's not a part of the manuscript, but it's a part of the thesis. If that's the case, then what I would ask is that each of those pieces be different chapters. So we've got chapter 2 is the manuscript, chapter 3 is the extended lit review, 4 is the extended methods. And then of course you'd have your introduction and your chapter 5. There it goes. And the front matter and the references and appendices. But notice that the order of those 3 chapters doesn't matter. So here, the manuscript came first. It might make more sense to have the extended literature review come first, and then the extended methods, and then the manuscript. Or maybe the manuscript is in between. I mean, there's a lot of flexibility there, and that's really up to you and your faculty member to talk about what that should look like. But the key from the graduate school's perspective is that those are chapters in the document, and they are bookended by the introduction and the conclusion. And of course, regardless of where the manuscript shows up, that's where its references would be. So if this diagram represented your thesis, these references that appear at the end would be coming from chapter 1, chapters 3 and 4, and chapter 5, because the only time you put references anywhere else is when it's a manuscript, okay? So one question I often receive is, should I have an alternative format or a traditional format for my thesis or dissertation? And I'll tell you that there are pros and cons to each, and there are a lot of things to consider in that process. But some things that you might want to think about, one is look at your program guidelines. I mean, it's very possible that your program guidelines say, nope, you have to do a traditional format, or they may say you have to do an alternative format. So make sure you look at your program guidelines and know that that's an option. You also need to talk with your thesis or dissertation chair. There are some faculty, and I'm not necessarily thinking of anyone at UCA, I'm thinking more broadly at the different places that I've been before. There's some faculty that are like, I absolutely will not do an alternative format. Or they'll say, I absolutely will only do alternative formats. And so you want to talk with your chair, and it actually may be a question you ask very early on to decide whether you want that person to be your chair is, what are their thoughts? I personally tell students that it really depends on your study. So some studies are designed in a way that developing 2 manuscripts absolutely makes sense, and therefore the alternative format, it would be the way to go. If that's not the case, then the traditional format is usually what I tell my students, but those are my students, and that's how I think about it. So talk to your chair and find out. And then, as I just said, the design of your study can often determine that. I think of an example where we had a student that was in biology education, and his study was in a classroom, and part of it was a qualitative study around the teacher's experience, and the other part of it was a quantitative study about the student's experience. So that right there set up 2 different manuscripts, one qualitative with one participant being the faculty member, the other quantitative where the participants were a bunch of students. So he used the alternative format, and that made sense based on the design of his study. I remember another thesis that I read at some point in the past where they tried to use an alternative format and it wasn't working. The reason it wasn't working was that the 2 manuscripts that they were writing, the methodology in those 2, there was so much overlap that you found yourself like, here were 5 paragraphs and you read the same 5 paragraphs over here. And if you tried to publish that, that would be like self-plagiarism. So that was a case where, you know, we went back to the student and said, you know, let's rethink this. Let's put this into a traditional format, because again, there was just too much overlap between the 2 studies and it didn't make sense. So the design of your study matters. The last stage that I'll talk about this afternoon is the final stage. And so this is for students who are like, they're in the home stretch. This is that last semester. And there are several steps that you'll go through, and I'll share these and then I'll highlight the timelines and so forth. But you have the application to graduate. You have to give notice of your defense. You'll give your defense. You'll submit your draft to ProQuest. I'll read it and give you some revisions and so forth. And then you'll submit your final hard copy to the graduate school. The deadlines for these, the application to graduate, and this is not an application to participate in the ceremony. This is, you want your degree. And so to get your degree, you have to apply and pay the graduation fee. So the deadline for that this semester is actually tomorrow. That's not a hard deadline. So if you miss that and you're applying Monday, it'll be okay. There is a point where if you apply after that point, you don't make it into the program for graduation, the commencement program. So I'm not sure what date that is, but if you're going to graduate this semester, you should go ahead and fill out the application. Now, do beware that if you fill that out and you pay the application fee, and then something happens and you don't actually get to defend, or maybe you have so many edits at the end that there's just no way you're going to graduate and complete it this semester. If that's the case, then you're going to have to apply again in the summer, and you'll have to pay that fee again. So make sure that when you're ready to apply, that you really are going to finish and graduate this semester, because I wouldn't want you to have to pay the fee twice. Second, the notice of defense. There's not a deadline for that, but typically we ask that you send that out 2 weeks before you plan to defend. Now, new this semester is we do have a new digital form that should be used to notify the graduate school. So you can go on our website and you'll see that form under the Forms tab. I believe that your faculty member has to initiate that form, but that notifies us that you have your defense up and coming. And if you're a dissertation student, we do advertise that to the entire campus community. For thesis defenses, we don't do that, but if you wanted us to, we could certainly do that. Either way, we ask that you fill out the form. We don't need the draft at that stage, but your college dean would like to see the draft at that stage. So be sure that as a part of that process, when you're ready to say, here's my defense, it's coming in 2 weeks, that you or your chair send that draft of your thesis or draft of your dissertation to your college dean. The deadline for defending is April 8th. If for some reason you need a few extra days, then you need to request an extension and describe your faculty member, actually your chair should request an extension, let us know what's going on and when the defense will be scheduled. And then the deadline for submitting your final draft to ProQuest is April 15th. So that should be the draft that everyone in the committee has read and they've approved, and from their perspective, it's final. Once it gets into ProQuest, that's when I read it and I will send you revisions to make. Sometimes they're major, only because people didn't follow the graduate school guidelines. Sometimes they're very minor. For example, if you don't have the right margin, I'm going to tell you what the margin is going to be. And typically it takes 2 or 3 rounds of you resubmitting to get the revisions in place that I'm looking for. But once you do that, I'll send you an email and it'll say, congratulations, and now you're ready to submit the hard copy. And at that time, you submit 1 copy on paper to the graduate school, and the deadline for that is May 2nd. So you can see that between April 15th and about April 30th, there's a, pretty much that's all I'm doing those 2 weeks is reading and providing feedback on the different theses and dissertations that are coming through. So it's really important to plan around that and know that you're going to be expected to work on that some more during that timeline. One thing that I wanted to point out, and I put new, and again, this is in quotation marks because it's been around for about 6 months, but people still don't know this, apparently, is we no longer require the committee signature approval page or the permission page in the actual thesis and dissertation. So when you look at our graduate school guidelines, you're going to see that the first page is your title page, and then the second page is the optional copyright page. But signatures, there were 2 pages that required signatures. We don't put that in the thesis or dissertation anymore. Instead, the committee form, that's now a digital form. It's initiated by your chair after you have successfully defended your thesis or dissertation. And then it routes and we keep it in our files. And then the permission form, that is a form that once you get that message that says congratulations, you have finished and you may turn your hard copy in now, that form will be attached to that message and you'll turn it in with your hard copy. So now I want to talk just a moment about some of the common requested corrections. You know, I mentioned a second ago that sometimes they're major, sometimes they're minor, but there are some that there's a clear theme about the types of corrections that I often have to request. And this is regardless of format. So first of all is to be sure to write about your study in past tense. And I mentioned that a moment ago. Often I'll see students who take something from the proposal, which was written in future tense, and then they paste it into the final draft, the dissertation or thesis, which is fine. Like, I mean, that's often part of the process, except that now it has to be in past tense. This is particularly true. I see it a lot of times with the film folks, I believe, because their abstract that they provide is written in future tense, and I'm constantly asking them to change that to past tense. It happens in all the ones that are research studies, particularly when they have like an extended methodology, because that was often written before they did the study. So make sure everything in it is written in past tense. Second, if you are doing research that involves human subjects or animals that fall under the IACUC policies, you have to include the IRB or the IACUC approval letter as one of your appendices. One of the mistakes I'll see, well, first of all, some people forget to include that. Sometimes they include like the consent forms instead of the actual approval letter. We don't have to see the informed consent forms or other pieces that fell as a part of the IRB. It's the actual letter that says your study has been approved. And you want to make sure your name's on that letter. Sometimes people include the one that maybe was the original, it had a faculty member on there. We need the one that shows that you had permission to do this work that's a part of your study. Another common error is in the front matter, and people will put stuff in there and they're just not in the right order. Right, so it's supposed to be title page, copyright page, acknowledgements, abstract, table of contents, and all that's laid out in our guidelines. But sometimes people will get them out of order, and then I end up having to ask them to put them in the right order. So just take a look at it to begin with. Make sure you've got things in the right order. Another common issue is figures. Like, it is so easy to go on the internet and download a figure or just do a copy and then paste it in there. So that's so easy to do. But to do that, you have to have permission to reprint. So when I see figures that look like they weren't generated by the author and instead they've come from external sources, I'll ask, do you have permission to reprint figures? And if you do, then that should be noted under the figure. That's where your style guide comes in. It'll tell you what to write in that space, but make sure you have permission to reprint figures. Left margin should be 1.5 inches all the way through the document. The date on the title page should just be month and year of graduation. So if you're defending in March, you're still going to put May of 2022 as your date. And then page numbers seem to be an issue. I'm not sure why, other than you're not looking at the style guide. I'm sorry, the thesis or dissertation guide. In the front matter, we use lowercase Roman numerals. Then when it gets to the main text, the page numbering starts over, so it's page 1. And then make sure the font of your page numbers matches the rest of the text. So if the whole thing's in Times New Roman, then that should be the font of your page number. A few more of these are specific to other folks that are using the alternative format. There should be a single abstract for the thesis or dissertation, and that occurs in the front matter. So if you have like 2 manuscript chapters, those manuscripts probably have an abstract written somewhere, but it's not going to show up in the thesis or dissertation. There's only one abstract. That's the abstract for the entire document, and it appears in the front matter. Similarly, if you have title pages for your manuscripts, you take those out. There's a single title page in the thesis or dissertation, and that appears on the front. Sometimes I have to ask students to renumber their tables or figures, because here's what happens. Let's say you've got 2 manuscripts, and in this one there's table 1, and in this one there's table 1. Well, then when you look at the table of contents for this particular document, you have 2 table 1s. So instead, you should probably name them with the chapter number first, so that the first one would be the first one would be table 2.1, and the next one would be table 3.1. So it's just important to keep in mind that you cannot have duplication of table numbers in the document, because this thing's going to be pieced together into a book. So think about that, and then use your chapter numbers to help you with that. And then if you have any kind of supplementary files, and the example I've used here is the supplementary literature review. Earlier, I talked about the extended literature review. Anything like that should not be in an appendix. An appendix should not suddenly have 80 pages of writing, right? That should instead be a chapter, and it should be inserted in the main text in somewhere in between that introduction chapter and that conclusion chapter. So in terms of resources, one tip that I want to give you is to seek editorial support. I have had some where I've returned it to the student and I said, I'm not going to read this until you've had an editor go through this. And then that delays everything. I haven't had that delay somebody to the point where they didn't graduate that semester, but we've come close. So proactively seek editorial support. Some faculty members are awesome at this. And so when they're reading your draft, they will give you that feedback. Other faculty members will look at it and they think, okay, that's not my responsibility. I'm only going to read for ideas. So you cannot rely on your committee members, and that's why I encourage you to seek editorial support. Now, you can ask a friend to read, of course, but some friends are better than others in terms of reading for grammar and editing and so forth. So make sure if you're using a friend that it's someone you know is a critical reader and they can give you that feedback. You can also utilize the Center for Writing and Communication on campus. They do have it where it's available for you to work with them virtually or online, so you don't have to come to campus to take advantage of those services. You can always hire an editor. People are constantly asking me if I'm aware of someone who will edit, and the answer is, I mean, I have someone I've used in the past, but he's kind of quit doing all that. So my answer is no, I don't have any recommendations for that, which there's a lot of money to be made in that, so I hate that I can't share names, but maybe your program coordinator has some, or maybe someone who's finished the program prior to you had someone that did a great job. So you can hire an editor. You can also use Grammarly, and what I'm hearing is like Grammarly is worth the money. In fact, if you haven't purchased it before the end of your program, then we've probably lost an opportunity, and we should be encouraging all of our students to get Grammarly at the beginning of their program, because that's a great support for helping you as you move through your program. And people say it's worth the money. There is a free version, so you can use it for free, but to do the work you need it to do for a thesis or dissertation, you would probably have to purchase it. And I don't know how much it costs off the top of my head. So the last topic I wanted to hit on was continuous enrollment. And for that, I'll just share this quote. So once you start enrolling in thesis or dissertation, whatever that first semester is that you enroll, then you're expected to enroll in it every semester until you finish, fall, spring, and summer. So while your program may say that you need 6 hours of thesis or 12 hours of dissertation, it is not uncommon for students to go beyond that and actually end up accruing more than that number of hours by the time they finish. So once you start, you're expected to continue enrolling. And if you're enrolling, you're expected to be working on it. If there's some legitimate reason that you feel like you shouldn't be forced to enroll in a certain semester, then you need to reach out directly to me and let's have a conversation so that I can learn what's going on. because if you don't register, then we're going to look at it, see you're not registered, and put you in at least 1 hour of that for you during that particular semester. So continuous enrollment is expected. It's not something that's just going to go away. So if you feel like you have a legitimate reason to not enroll, then you need to reach out to me and let's have a conversation about that, okay? Other resources, if you go to our website and click on the current students tab and you scroll all the way to the bottom, I don't know why it's at the bottom, but at the bottom it says thesis and dissertation. And so here's some snapshots of what you'll see on that particular page. We have our upcoming schedule for the different deadlines that I shared earlier. You can see the spring dates, but you can also see summer. So if you're someone who's thinking about summer, and then pretty soon we'll have fall up there as well. So you can look ahead to find when those dates are. This is where you'll find the thesis and dissertation guide. So you can click right there and you can download it, and make sure you've downloaded it and you're looking at it, as opposed to someone sending it to you, because someone that's been using it might be using an outdated version. So we do update this, and we try to put the date at the bottom to show when it was last updated. I think the last update was September of 21. So make sure you're looking at the most recent version. And then right below that, there's several links. So there's the guide again, to make it easy to see. There's that committee form that we talked about, and permission forms. And also I want to point out there's a front matter template. So if you're not word savvy and you're struggling with having like lowercase Roman numerals versus uppercase Arabic numeral, not uppercase, but Arabic numerals, etc., the front matter template can help you if you just download that and start working with it. So I believe that's all I had, which is plenty, and it's not very exciting information. So I hope that you stuck with me through that. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if we have questions. And again, you can use the chat feature or the Q&A feature. So here's a question that also has a statement. What if we're on the fringe and never mind? And I'm guessing that is, what if I think I might graduate this semester, but I'm not sure? I mean, that deadline to defend is April 8th, right? So you've got your defense. It's got to occur before April 8th, which means you have to have a draft out to your committee by like the end of March. So you should have a pretty good idea by the 1st of March whether you're going to graduate it or not. And so at that point, you should have already, or at least go ahead and do it at that point, applied to graduate. And if you're not, then you can wait and apply once you know. We've had people apply, you know, a week, 2 weeks before the commencement ceremony, and that's okay. The problem is you won't be in the commencement program. So, you know, if you're planning to be there at commencement and your family is going to be opening up that commencement handbook looking for your name, if you've missed that date, you're not going to be in there, and there's nothing we can do about that. So that's the only danger really of applying late. So I'll hang around for a moment and see if we have some other questions. So you can, again, use the chat or the Q&A to type your questions. And as we're waiting, I'll say that in my office, it's Jennifer Bell, who's the person that keeps track of thesis and dissertation related stuff. So if you have questions about different things related to that, you can also always reach out directly to her. You can always reach out directly to me if you have questions about any of the feedback that I give you, or if you have a question related to formatting and your dissertation chair can't answer it. You can call me and I'll be happy to try to answer your question, since I'm the one that ends up looking at it at the end anyway. I have a comment that's saying thank you, so I'll say you're welcome. Show the first slide of the common requested corrections. Okay, let's see. Let me go back. I think it's that one. Yep. That's it right there. Yeah, so this particular webinar has been recorded, and so it'll take us a couple of days, but we'll get it uploaded to our YouTube page, not YouTube page, YouTube channel. Once we have that done, then we'll send an email out to everyone who registered. And I encouraged people to register even if they couldn't be here today so that they get that information. But we'll send that out to you, so you'll have that link and you can refer back to this. I'll also send out this particular PowerPoint so that you've got it as well. And that can help you to be sure that you are thinking about these different common issues that we see when people are working on this stuff. Okay. Let's see. All right. I think that person got that. I'll stop sharing. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, I appreciate, again, y'all taking your time out today to listen to me. I won't say chat with me, to listen to me. And then, oh, wait, we've got another, here's a question. Okay, so that's a good question. So this is about graduation. So the date of the conferral of your degree is not necessarily the same as the commencement date, right? So the degree conferral date will be that Saturday. That is the undergraduate ceremony. And I don't have a calendar in front of me, so I don't remember what day that is. But the graduate commencement ceremony will be on Friday. So it'll be on Friday night. Either way, when you're applying, we know you're applying for the graduate commencement ceremony. And if you have issues with that, you can reach out to Jennifer Bell. But again, the commencement ceremony date is going to be different from the degree conferral date. And sometimes that causes some confusion. Okay, excellent. All right, well, if you have questions, know that I'm here. You can always send me an email. You can call the graduate school. Not right now, we're not there. We're not gonna be there tomorrow either, thanks to this cold weather, but we'll be back in on Monday. And my email is abarlow5, don't forget the digit 5, @uca.edu. And y'all have a great afternoon, and congratulations on making it to this point. And I wanna see you cross the stage really soon, okay? Y'all have a good one.